it looks like when you say that, you're back to like a Fregean sort of view of propositions. Like, here's this
Yeah.
proposition that's out there representing the water bottle as
Right.
being blue and having these truth conditions, right?
Yeah.
And your mind, you're just kind of seeing it and latching onto it. It's like it's out there as a unified whole, and your mind's kind of latching onto it. I don't know why.
No, that's good. I like that. That's good imagery.
It's like there's a planet and
Yeah.
something like that.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. This episode is another very special one, and I have another very special guest with me. Today, we're going to be talking about the argument from intentionality for the existence of God, and I have with me Dr. Lorraine Juliano Keller. And we're going to be talking about her contribution to the 24 or so arguments for God. This book is fantastic. I love it. It's edited by Jerry Walls and Trent Doherty. Hers is the first essay up, and it's fantastic. This is like the stuff that I'm into. I love getting conceptual with it. So we're going to be talking about that. Before we jump in, though, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen. Over on Patreon, it's the best way to support the podcast. If you like this, if you want to see me continue to do this, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can join for as little as $3 a month and as much as like $100. So that would be sick. Either way, any support helps. Really, really appreciate that. You can also leave me a 5-star review if you're watching that, or if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts. Again, that'd be huge. So without further ado, let's just jump right in with Dr. Keller and get into the argument for God from intentionality. Dr. Keller, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I really, really like your argument. I think it's super intriguing. Before we jump in, I want to read a quote from that you quoted, just to give us a rough sketch overview of the argument. So you say, or actually, I can't remember if this was from Leibniz or not. I should know this, but I don't. I'm going to read it, and then maybe you can tell me. Truth involves representation. Something is true only if it represents reality as being a certain way, and reality is that way. But representation is a function of minds. So truth is mind-dependent. Yet there are truths that transcend the human mind. For example, eternal truths. So there must be a supreme mind with the representational capacity to think these transcendent truths. Therefore, a supreme mind vis-a-vis God exists. I can't remember if that was you or if you're quoting someone.
That's me.
Awesome. All right, cool.
But it was set off kind of like a block quote because it's just supposed to give the rough idea of the argument, like as it's appeared historically, just trying to give a rough, intuitive sense of the argument before actually presenting a more rigorous version. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Well, before we get into the more rigorous formulation of it, how'd you get into this argument? How'd you get interested in it?
Well, I was looking at your outline, looking at that question, trying to remember myself how I got interested in it because I don't really remember. But I think really from just thinking about propositions. So my dissertation was on. Oh, sorry, my computer is doing something.
No worries.
It was on arguments for structured propositions, critically evaluating them and saying, really, there aren't good arguments for structured propositions. That was kind of the verdict. So I was looking at a lot at the work of people like Scott Soames, Jeff King, and then also Peter Hanks, and they were. Really, Soames had changed his view radically around the time that I was writing, and I noticed a lot of people going in this other direction, right? So, looking at propositions, not so much as mind independent, intrinsically intentional, abstract objects.
Yeah.
It's complicated, so
sure.
Whatever I feel like I'm stumbling a little bit explaining it. So they're still viewing propositions as abstract objects, right? But making the representational power and intentionality of propositions derive from token mental events or acts of predication or things like that, right?
Yeah.
And so really, in some ways, going back to an earlier view, right, that would see propositions as judgments, right? And that's kind of the view that I call psychologism.
Right.
Psychologism is one of those words where it's, it's always dangerous to use it because it gets used in so many different ways. That's kind of how I'm using it. Like
Okay.
the idea that the fundamental bearers of truth are mental entities of some sort. And so I felt like there's a weird similarity there, right? Where it's kind of like they're going back to a more kind of psychologistic view of propositions, but not going all the way because realizing the shortcomings, when you deny that propositions are these abstract kind of necessarily existent objects. And so, and I was just thinking like, what the problems for psychologism are, and then thinking, well, do those problems apply to this view? And then that got me realizing like, well, a major problem is if you want to use kind of human intentionality to ground the representational properties of all propositions, you're not going to have enough.
Right.
Because we want there to be this whole kind of Boolean algebra of propositions. You're not going to get that, from human intentionality. And so, that made me think like, well, you could get that if you had a divine mind.
Yeah.
Right. And so I thought like, oh, that's interesting. Like just looking at the shortcomings of this view kind of gives you a version of this theistic argument. And so I think that, sorry if that was too long-winded.
No,
but I think that's how it
fantastic.
happened.
Yeah, and my audience should be pretty familiar with these type of arguments because I love divine conceptualism and I've had several people on to talk about them. So, yeah, feel free to go in as deep as you want on this stuff. I believe you did your dissertation at Notre Dame. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Did you happen to like run into Josh Rasmussen there? Because I think he was working on a structured view of propositions when he was there.
I do know Josh. We overlapped, and we've talked over the years about propositions and about our views too, just running into each other at conferences. And I think we were both at, the University of St. Thomas has a seminar they were doing in the summers, like 2 or 3 week seminar. And I'd been to a couple of those. I think one my husband John was in and one I was in. But we both kind of hung out. And I remember seeing Josh at one of those and talking a lot about propositions with him.
So cool. Yeah. That's really fascinating because I've thought about his view of structured propositions in an argument for divine conceptualism. So it's fun that you're saying no, we don't want structured propositions. Just really quick, do you still hold that view? Would you say that like propositions are unanalyzable and just like brutally intentional? Or I guess not brutally because they're divine ideas or something, right?
Yeah, no, so when I gave this argument, it was based on sort of premises that I don't really accept.
Okay.
But it was more like, oh, if you accept these premises, here's a good argument for a divine mind. But I don't personally accept them. With a lot of views in philosophy, I hold them rather lightly because I just think philosophy is hard, and I just kind of always want to be ready to change my mind.
Yeah, I'm with
follow
you.
And follow the argument where it leads. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, I guess I just think there are lots of good reasons to not think propositions are structured. There are a lot of problems with the view, so it's more of like a negative argument that I have against, thinking of propositions as being structured, but not that I have such a great positive alternative.
Yeah.
But I am, sort of inclined towards a primitive entity sort of view. Trent Merrick's recently, did a great book where he defends a view like that, and George Beeler has a view like that that I'm also partial to. That he kind of his view lets him say a lot of stuff about structure without actually saying propositions are structured, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, that's pretty sweet. Well, one more thing before we get in. So I'll change it up from the outline, but I like your argument because it's different than ones presented by like Greg Welty, James Anderson, Proust, and Rasmussen, where they go in for they hone in or they focus in on the necessity of certain propositions. There are necessarily true propositions, and bracket off everything else. We'll just hone in on this, home in maybe, and then so you need a divine a necessary thinker in order to think that necessary truth. And you're not really it doesn't really matter about the necessity or a contingency of these. It's just like there's this sheer huge amount of propositions, and so a human mind or a finite mind couldn't do the trick of grounding all of these. So it's still in the same ballpark, but it's just looking at different things. I think that's really fascinating. Does that sound right, at least as an initial?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I might put it a little differently.
Okay.
For me, it's not so much the amount of propositions. There could just be one
Oh, okay.
to do the trick for my argument. Just that there are propositions, or there is at least one proposition that is not cognizable by a
Oh,
finite
right, right.
mind, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, I do think there are infinitely many,
Yeah.
so that's fine. But even if there were infinitely many, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. Um, but especially if you do the kind of maneuvers that Soames does with like systematicity and things like that.
Okay.
And depending on whether you're like a serious actualist or not, kind of
Yeah.
moves you can make to get around the representational force of the propositions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more about there being certain kinds of propositions that aren't thinkable by finite thinkers, or aren't entertainable, I guess I should
Oh, yeah.
say.
Okay. But yeah, we have evidence that those are true propositions, that we need them, right? Like we know about them, but we can't cognize them ourselves. Does that sound right?
Yeah, yeah. So I got kind of into the weeds a little bit with some math to kind of
Yeah.
to make the case that we have to countenance these propositions. But yeah, so the idea is just that there are, we're committed to these propositions existing because like our best mathematical theories commit us to them, and
Yeah.
so that should be enough for philosophers. We don't want to be telling mathematicians how to do their job.
Right.
I think David Lewis has some famous quote about that, but yeah, just gonna kind of invoke his authority there.
That's good. Yeah. Well, let's jump in on like the formalization then. I have a slide for us. Hopefully this comes through. There we go. All right. So, folks at home, sorry if this is a little small, but I'm going to read them for us, and then we can look at especially 2 and 5, premise 2 and 5. So here's the argument. Premise 1: there are propositions, non-linguistic entities that are fundamentally true or false in virtue of their representational properties. 2: only thoughts are fundamentally true or false due to their representational properties. 3: so propositions are thoughts. 4: if propositions are thoughts, they are either human or divine thoughts. 5: but there are not enough human thoughts to play the role of propositions. 6: so propositions are not human thoughts. 7: propositions are divine thoughts. 8: if there are divine thoughts, then there is a unique divine thinker. 9: therefore, there is a unique divine thinker, God. I love that. And then you say let's focus in on 2 and 5, because there's going to be two different takes. Um, there's going to be the traditional conception of propositions, and then there's going to be propositional naturalists, and they're going to respectively take on premise 2 and 5. Just real quick, what about 1? Should we just say like, hey, look, this is for like realists? If you're not a realist, then you're just not going to like this argument.
So realists about propositions, you
Yeah.
mean?
Sorry. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I tried to word it so that it's pretty neutral about what propositions are, like what their nature is. Except, I mean, well, it's not terribly neutral, um, but they're non-linguistic. But propositions could be thoughts. They could be mental sentences of some sort. I mean, I guess it is non-linguistic, so maybe not mental sentences, but uh, yeah. So, but I think it depends on what you mean by realism, but there's
Yeah.
something that plays the role of like fundamentally true or false things that are fundamentally true or false by virtue of their representational properties, and they're not like sentences of a language. I can't
Okay.
remember exactly what I was thinking there, but I think I was thinking more of like not sentences of like a public language, like a natural language,
Okay.
um, because then that would be problematic for obvious reasons.
Okay. So if someone doesn't hold to like the existence of abstract objects, would premise 1 could premise still 1 still work on them?
Yeah, I mean, if you believe in if you think thoughts are fundamentally true or
Oh yeah.
false in virtue of their representational properties, then you've got, you know, non-abstract things that play the proposition role.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's ultimately where this argument is going, right? Saying
Right.
like, if only thoughts have this, feature of being fundamentally representational, then they have to play the role of propositions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a really good point. Usually I'm used to Welty and Anderson's argument, the Lord of Non-contradiction, where they have to like motivate that there are these such things as abstract propositions which are abstract objects, and then from there they move on to, hey, these are thoughts and here's a good reason for thinking they're thoughts because of intentionality. But this argument, if you're like a psychologist, I don't know how to say that, if you hold to psychologism or some kind of human conceptualist, then look, you don't have to do all this motivating work to say, let's be Platonists about propositions, or Phrygians about senses or something like that. You can just continue on in the argument. That's really fascinating. I like that.
Well, it's nice to be able to bypass those issues. And I
Right.
know, Welty's view has been criticized for being, I guess, like a form of nominalism in sheep's clothing or something.
Yeah.
Right? That,
Yeah.
no, they can't really be abstract objects if they're thoughts.
Right. And then, yeah, so he says, well, they're functional right there. They still play the same functional role for us as if they were abstract. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Right. So, I mean, there'll be, back and forth about that, or whether that's really, adequate for being an abstract object. I mean, you could say, I mean, the functionality could just be like, that's how we define propositions. They play the proposition roles, or they play the property roles, or whatever it is that you're talking about for whatever kind of object. But you might say, well, unless they have certain, qualities, they can't really count as being abstract.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So then we kind of have, so in defending premise 2, only thoughts are fundamentally true or false due to their representational properties. Yeah. So the traditional conception, I can't tell if the traditional conception is committed to like Platonism about this, but what if the Platonist just comes back and says, well, there are these things, propositions, which are fundamentally true or false, which, thoughts, that they serve as the content of thoughts. So maybe they're even more fundamental than thoughts are.
Yeah, that would be the traditional conception, and
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
why this argument depends on a rejection of that.
Yeah.
Right, and so it would be accepted by people who reject the traditional conception, and that would be people in the kind of tradition of thinking about propositions before, Bolzano and Frege and all those people,
Yeah.
for most of history. I mean, there are some exceptions, and then when I say propositions too, I mean, that's really like historians of philosophy would probably like balk at that because I'm speaking kind of loosely about like things
Sure.
that play the proposition roles, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you have some early kind of outliers like the Stoics, think about meaning and propositions kind of abstractly,
Yeah.
and I think like Abelard has a view sort of like that, and there's some medieval philosophers,
Yeah.
theologians that have views like that. But kind of like historically, the dominant view is that, the fundamental truth bearers are, are thoughts of some sort, or mental entities, mental sentences of some sort. And then, huge shift with like Frege and the kind of anti-psychologistic arguments from Frege and Husserl and stuff.
Yeah.
And then, and I think that's been kind of like the dominant view in analytic philosophy for people who do believe in propositions. It seems like, oh, they're abstract, they're mind and language independent, they're necessary, there are an infinite number of them, et cetera. And then it's just recently that's kind of coming under attack with this, what I'm calling propositional naturalism.
Yeah.
And it's because a lot of the ways that, people like Scott Soames and Jeff King talk about their view is they are really motivated by naturalistic concerns, right? Being able to give a naturalistic account of intentionality.
Right.
And so the idea that, oh, there are these brutally representational abstract things out there just kind of doesn't sit well. I mean, there's no, like you might have some hope of being able to naturalize the mind or naturalize, mental representation, but there's zero hope of naturalizing, brute a representation by abstract objects.
Yeah.
So I think that's, and there's a lot of criticism like, oh, this is spooky. This is just, an explanatory dead end. And why should we say things like this? And so, so that's kind of traditional conception of thinking of propositions as fundamentally representational has just really, kind of come under attack from these guys. And so that's why I thought, okay, it's nice to like re-examine this argument because now this kind of more psychologistic friendly view is gaining traction among people that are talking about propositions.
Yeah. Is do you have like why should we how do you motivate two, I guess, for someone who is a Platonist about propositions? Like, do you think that, like, is the Ben problem like a pretty big deal for them? Should they like not like how do they access this realm? Like, is that a big problem?
Yeah, so that is a problem that people worry about. That, sorry, I didn't know which Benesser problem you were talking about because there are a few different ones,
right,
or a couple different ones. But yeah, the access, the Benesser access problem. That the idea that if we have these abstract objects in our ontology, how are our minds accessing them? Like, how do we know about them? How do we? They're acausal, right? So, I think that is a worry that a lot of people have. That does come up in the criticisms of like Soames and King and stuff like that too. So this idea that somehow our minds were grasping these abstract, primitively representational entities. There's this mysterious grasping relation that people will invoke, and it's like, what's that supposed to be? Interestingly, I was just thinking about this again. For Frege, like when he talks about thoughts, so he uses the German word, and I'm going to butcher the German because I'm not like a native German speaker or anything, but Gedanken, right? So that's his word for the things that play the role of propositions in his theory. And he, I think he says that they are, I think he says they're actual, which means that they do have some sort of causal powers. So it made me want to revisit, like, it's been a while since I've really looked at Frege and any death. It made me want to revisit Frege's view about this. But I know, when you think about it, it's like, well, what are we grasping? We're not it's not like anybody who believes in abstract propositions thinks you just kind of grasp a proposition with no intermediary. It's like, no, there's some sort of a sentence or some sort of a thought that has a proposition as content. And that is a concrete token of some sort. And so, but then there's this whole question about what about the relation between that sort of representational vehicle and the proposition itself, and then you're going to have other issues there that are going to kind of, it's just like pushing the bump in the carpet. So I think there are some serious worries there, and then there's just a worry too about what exactly are we saying, like when we say that these things are inherently representational, like how can that be? It just seems like mystery mongering of some sort.
Like how are they just like brutally intentional? They're just like these brutally intentional objects that just have always existed, and some of them seem like they should be tensed or something, or they're about certain things. They're true at a time but not another time. It's like I get that, and especially when we have other intentional things like thoughts in our disposal, which are super close to us because we have them. And so it's like, it seems like we have these other things that are intentional that are thoughts. And so maybe a better explanation is that propositions are thoughts.
Yeah. And so that's not exactly what so that's more like psychologism, right? And that's more like the traditional view. Like if you look, propositions are judgments or something like that. But So these guys, so like Soames and Hanks and others will say, will identify propositions not with the token thoughts themselves, but with types, right?
Okay.
So like for Soames, there are the types of certain kinds of acts of predication,
Yeah.
right? And so it's the thought tokens that have the intentionality. And so the propositions are derivatively representational because of their relation to the thought tokens. So you've got these types, and they get their representational power from the tokens.
That's interesting. I need to check out Some's work, I think, more. But that so prior to the token like instances, the types weren't intentional, like they weren't representational. Because it seems like it's going backwards, right? It seems like the if the tokens are giving the types their intentionality, then they're not inherently intentional, but they became intentional or something. Am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, I mean, so right. So if you think, okay, well, what do you mean by types? Are types abstract objects that exist eternally and all that stuff? I mean, do they have all these sort of, traditional abstract object properties? And if so, it seems like they would pre-exist
Right.
the tokens. So, I mean, so Soames, he's not, I'm trying to remember his exact views about this stuff. It's been a while, but I know he's not a serious actualist. I don't think he's an actualist at all.
Okay.
I don't want to say something false about his view, but so he really can avail himself of a lot of, he can make a lot of moves here to kind of get enough tokens by going beyond the actual world.
Okay.
Right. And so like, oh, well, as long as there's like, somebody in some possible world, some thinker in some possible world, thinking, making this act of predication, that's enough
Oh
for
yeah.
the representational, basis for the type
Yeah.
to be there, right? So,
Okay.
yeah.
That's clever. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. Okay. I'll have to think about that one more. I've heard that used against Welty and Anderson's argument too, for like you need a necessary mind in order to ground this necessary truth. And they might say, well, no, all you need is just a thinker in every possible world. But then you go, well, maybe there's an empty possible world with no thinker. But it would still be true that the law of non-contradiction is applicable or something like that. Okay, yeah. So that's fascinating. The possible worlds move always gets me. It always catches me off guard. So that's fun. So let's move on to. So that's the traditional conception. Maybe we can move on to propositional naturalism, unless you have anything else to add on the traditional conception and why we might, or how you might defend against that move.
Yeah, we can move on.
Okay, sweet. Yeah. So I guess this is like an empirical fact or whatever, but like how popular is propositional naturalism? Is it do you see it like overtaking the traditional conception or? Yep.
I'm very bad at assessing things like that.
Okay.
Like somebody needs to just make like a Phil paper survey on propositions on,
Yeah. Yeah.
and to take a poll or something like that. Cause I really don't know. But I mean, there's just so many weird different camps in philosophy too, and different like
Right.
groups that talk to each other and stuff like that. So I feel like among like the group that I around when I go to conferences about propositions, it's a pretty popular view, though I do meet, some people that are like, this is just, thank you for arguing against this view because it's horrible. And why is this view taking over?
Yeah.
But another thing too, that's been going on is increasingly more people have just been denying that propositions represent at all.
Hmm.
So like Jeff Speaks has that view, Mark Richard, I think Brian Pickle, but a bunch of people that work on this stuff just will say like, propositions don't represent at all. And so they're also, I mean, that's just another way of like denying the traditional conception of like the more Phrygian or however you say it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Conception of propositions. I hear both ways. So that's another kind of view that's been gaining momentum. It's just like propositions have truth conditions, but they don't represent, and you don't need to represent to have truth conditions. And there's like debates about that too. So,
Okay.
but yeah, so that's another
So someone who, so if you presented this to like Speaks, maybe he would be, maybe he would say he would just deny one because one, there are propositions, non-linguistic entities that are fundamentally true or false in virtue of the representational properties.
Yes.
And you say,
Mhm.
no, we don't need representational properties for them to be true or false.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So the people that deny the representationality of propositions will just deny one, yes. But that's, I was like, well, I'm just not talking to them
Yeah, right.
because
Right.
I can't, there's always, in philosophy, there's always somebody representing some different view, and you can't, and that's a very, I think that's a really new view. Like, I don't think that has a historical precedent.
Sure.
And it's not like, uh, it's not like a really wildly popular view either. So I feel like it's safe to, you know, um, set that to the side.
Yeah.
For the sake of this sort of argument, like, I just think like certain arguments are just not going to work on certain people. Like, just you got to
Right.
just, if you want to convince them of a certain conclusion, you're going to have to just go with a different argument.
Yeah, and that has to do with like the person relativity of proofs or arguments. And luckily there's 24 or so other ones, they're in
Right.
this book. So
Exactly.
yeah. Um yeah, so can you help us out? Like what is propositional naturalism before we go any further here?
So it's just this idea that the representational or intentional properties of propositions derive from the representational properties of minds,
Yeah.
right, of agents, right? And so, and the usual story is involves acts of predication,
Mhm.
right? So agents perform these acts of predication, and that's where you get uh, the representational power that
Yeah.
the types of those token acts of predication are propositions, and so they're getting their representational power. They're deriving it from the tokens, and so it's interesting because this does sort of come out of a tradition of thinking of propositions as being structured.
Mhm.
So, as you're probably aware, right, a big problem that's plagued the structure view is the unity problem,
Yeah.
right? Like, what is it that unifies, uh, structure propositions, and you want to make whatever unifies them not turn them into facts, right? Because
Mhm.
then you don't wear the false propositions then and things like that,
Yeah.
right? That was like the famous kind of Russell principles of mathematics thing.
Mhm.
And so, that's another criticism that's been leveled against the traditional conception. When the traditional conception is construed in a structured way, like, especially, I mean, if you think of somebody like Frege, right? Frege had structured propositions.
Yeah.
And when it's construed in that way, then one criticism of it is, well, look, it's facing this unity problem. But a way the naturalistic view solves the unity problem is by saying, like, look, here's what's uniting the constituents. They're united by these acts of predication. And the good thing about acts of predication, right, is that they can be false, right? They can go wrong, right? They
Yeah.
can misfire. So you can easily see how you get false propositions in there by saying, like, oh, you predicated, the property of being red of this blue thing, right? And so that's what you're representing this thing as being a color that it isn't. And so that's where you get the representational powers of this false proposition, the act type of predicating blueness of this cup or something, whatever it
Right.
is.
Right. So I'm wondering, in that on that view, um, I mean, I'm following all this, like the acts of predication. That's what's unifying, and then that's where the intentionality comes from. But wouldn't the act of predication, um, wouldn't that be like derivative intentionality from a thought? Wouldn't the thought be like the fundamental thing there? Unless I don't know, unless you have like an act of predication without a thought behind it, maybe.
Well, I guess the idea is that the act of predication is the thought. Like, the thought when you're
Mm,
thinking, like, oh, this bottle is blue. What is that thought? That's your predicating being blue of the bottle.
okay, so it's just it's like one thing. Well, because I can have that thought without predicating it. Oh, maybe not. Okay, so maybe it's just that's just like the speech act of maybe I can predicate in my mind.
No, good. Actually, what you're saying is good. So you're actually latching onto a debate within this camp,
Cool.
right?
Okay.
So there is a debate about whether predication is neutral or forceful, right? So Scott Soames thinks that predication is neutral, right? And so he thinks of like predication is just like entertainment, kind of. It plays the role of entertainment. And like Peter Hanks thinks predication is forceful, right? And so you're endorsing, so when you're predicating, you're like, affirming something as true, right?
Yeah, right.
It's not just like, let me think about this, whether or not this water bottle is blue, or let me like entertain the possibility or something like that, right? It's actually the predication itself is forceful. But then he runs into problems because that's, he runs into what's called, the Frege-Geach problem, right? And that was a famous problem that plagued the idea that propositions are judgments, right? Because, think about all the different kind of logically complex propositions that we can, entertain, right? Like conditionals and negations and things like that, disjunctions, right? Where it's like, you're not necessarily judging true the proposition, right? Or the constituents of the proposition, right? Like the disjuncts or the antecedent or whatever, right? And so Hanks has to do kind of some fancy footwork with his view. He introduces these whole like cancellation contexts and things like that to kind of, I'm not going to get into that, obviously, but read Hanks for the details. And then he has a debate with Soames about this, because Soames gets criticized because if let me see if I can remember how this goes exactly. So if predication is neutral, that looks like he is then just kind of trying to like what's the expression? Oh my gosh, why can't I remember what it is? He's trying to eat his cake and have it.
Oh, have his cake and eat it too?
Have his cake and eat it too, or whatever.
Yeah.
Sorry, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And so that he can't really help himself to this idea of like neutral predication, because that's, so if predication is neutral, right? It looks like when you say that, you're back to like a Fregean sort of view of propositions. Like, here's this proposition that's out there representing the water bottle as being blue and having these truth conditions, right?
Yeah.
And your mind, you're just kind of seeing it and latching onto it. It's like it's out there as a unified whole, and your mind's kind of latching onto it. I don't know why.
No, that's good. I like that. That's good imagery.
It's like there's a planet and you're something like that. But you can't do that if you want predication to play this role of grounding representation, right? Because then really predication is not explaining anything. It's not explaining how the proposition is representing the world as being a certain way if it's neutral. So I think that's kind of, the argument against Soames is neutral view. And then the argument against Hanks is forceful view is the Frege-Geach problem. And then he has to introduce cancellation context. And a lot of people are very skeptical about that.
Okay. So yeah, the Hanks one I'll have to look into to even make sense of that. But the Soames one makes a lot of sense to me, because it's like, you're saying your whole project is trying to get away from propositions being brutally representational or representational in themselves, however you cash that out. But it looks like if you want to stay neutral, then they have to be. So you're kind of canceling out your own view, which is fascinating. Yeah, man, I love this stuff. I need to like get back into the literature on it. I really, it's so hard trying to tell my wife, like, I want to talk about propositions today. I'm going to go and like sit in the corner and think about them and then try to explain all these views. And it's like, sometimes you just lose it. And you're like, what am I talking about again? I forgot. Oh wait, no, I'm talking about propositions because I have to have them in order to communicate. So I don't know if we've already kind of like broached it or not, but in the paper you talk about Soames' theory of naturalized cognitive propositions, NCP. Have we already got there, or can you lay that one out for us as well?
Yeah. So I mean, I think we've kind of gone over it, right? I mean, he just thinks that there are these fundamental, acts of predication.
Yeah.
And that's and those acts of predication, represent things as being a certain way. And then propositions are derivative from that. I mean, I'm sort of hesitant to say, like, I kind of want to look and see what the how the view is defined, because it's been a while, and I did this paper I wrote years ago, and I don't really remember it that well. I did read over it this weekend because I was like, I need to read this again because I don't even remember what I said.
I took it to be like a particular instance or particular theory in propositional naturalism that you're just kind of like picking out, and then in arguing against this view, you show like why all propositional naturalism might fail.
Right. Yeah. So he's saying that right, propositions are repeatable, purely representational cognitive acts, and right. So entertaining a proposition is performing it. So the intentionality of the act of entertaining is the intentionality of the proposition itself. And he says agents represent in a primary sense by predicating properties of objects, whereas cognitive act types represent in an extended or derivative sense. So I think that sort of covers it. I mean, gets you the basics of his views. I just didn't want to attribute something to him that wasn't quite right, especially because there's like different views in this area that are slightly different. So like Hanks has a view, then Indrek Ryland also defends a cognitive act view of propositions. And so just trying to keep them all straight and not mix them up with each other. But I use Holmes because he gives the most explicit sort of existence conditions for propositions. Like so Jeff Speaks originally, so Jeff King, Soames and Jeff Speaks had written this book together, New Thinking About Propositions. And they each defended their different views of propositions. And in that book, Jeff Speaks had raised the objection to Soames, like, hey, are there going to be enough propositions on your view? I mean, it's just a very natural objection to come up with, right? Like, wait a minute, if these are, if you got these acts of predication, token acts of predication have to like ground all the representational properties of propositions. How are you going to, like, what about all these propositions people would never think of? What about like propositions about really big numbers and things like that? And so Soames had answered that in a, pretty sophisticated way using his kind of maneuvers from, denying serious actualism and also his appeal to systematicity. So he was able to kind of evade a lot of the kind of first pass objections of that nature. And so that's why I really wanted to focus on his view, because I thought like he's already kind of answered a lot of the first pass objections. And so I can, show how like even his view is going to fall prey to this problem. And if his does, then the others are going to as well. I tried to generalize the argument in another section to try to show that it would apply to any view that shares this core feature of Soames's view. But just using his is kind of like the illustration, right, to latch onto, because he was the one who already addressed some of these issues.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. So can you broach the scarcity objection for us?
Yeah, so basically just the idea is if there are propositions, right, that or if there is a proposition, I guess I should say, that is such that its representational properties cannot be explained by appeal to the powers of finite thinkers, then basically Soames is in trouble, right? Then there are going to be propositions that his view doesn't account for, right? They're left out, right, of his view. So trying to, kind of force him to see that his view is inadequate by saying, look, even you will want to acknowledge that there are these propositions, but you're not going to be able to account for them unless you were to say, oh, there's, a possible infinite mind that can think that. But that then undercuts the whole sort of naturalistic motivation, right? Like, let's explain the whole point, right, of this view is not wanting to have a kind of a spooky theory of intentionality and wanting to be able to explain all representation in terms of ultimately in some sort of naturalistically acceptable way. But then that's, that's kind of how the objection works against him. And so just trying to think of an example of like some proposition that he would be forced to acknowledge and say, look, there's no way that a finite thinker is going to be able to perform this act of predication.
Yeah. That's so good. So yeah, so can you lay us out? Because I'm doing my best here, working on like math and philosophy of math type stuff. It's tough for me. So like this whole part of the essay, I was like, seems right, but I don't know that I could represent it myself. Can you help us? Like, what's a good instance of a proposition that will not be able to be accounted for on Solmes's theory?
So, okay. So like I said, he already dealt with this kind of really big number kind of objection, or like, what about
Right.
like, I mean, because you could think of like really obvious objections, right? Like infinite conjunctions, infinite
Yeah.
disjunctions, right? Huge, numbers, that, or whatever, go on, the full expansion of pi or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so he was like, no, like I can deal with these. I can account for these. I mean, and you could kind of press him about that and say like, well, this is cheating to like appeal to systematicity here and things like that. But I was like, well, like, let's just let him have that because I think I don't need it. I think I can come up with an example that doesn't rely on that. And actually, I have to say that I was having a lot of conversations with, so like my husband, John Keller is a philosopher, and he's more of a metaphysics person, I guess, and I'm more of a philosophy of language person, but we have a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
And we co-author things together. So I was talking about this with him a lot. A little bit obsessed for a while about this and stopped talking about it. And he was like, oh, hey, I have an idea for you. What about the axiom of choice? And I was like, what?
Mm.
And so he deserves credit. And I did credit him. I was like, you will get a footnote.
That's so awesome. Yeah.
So I was like, I'm not going to take credit for that. So it was his idea to use the axiom of choice. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant, actually. So, it's just in standard axiomatizations. I can never say that word. I hope I'm saying it right. I think I
I'm
might
glad
have
you're
missed
saying it. Yeah.
of set theory, right? That you got Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory with the axiom of choice, ZFC, right? That's kind of like, this is what you learn when you learn set theory.
Mhm.
And so basically the axiom of choice says that for any collection of mutually disjoint non-empty sets, there's a choice set containing exactly one element from each member of the collection, right? So it's just like basically you're, choosing, you've got this big, why do we have to talk about the size? I don't know. You got this big set of sets, right? That contains all these sets, and then like, so take, and they're disjoint, right? And non-empty, but that's important. And then you take an element from each one. Now you've got this new set, right? And so it's just a kind of a generative principle that gets you all these sets. And the idea is that they're intuitively arbitrary sets, right? Because like, it's just kind of random, like what's in there. And so that was the kind of inspiration. The inspiration for using that was just trying to get around the systematicity thing, right? So like, if you think about it, like, okay, think about how we grasp sets, right? Well, we can grasp infinite sets, right? Like the set of all prime numbers. Well, how do you grasp that set? Because you know what it is to be a prime number. Right. There's this well-defined predicate, being a prime number, and you know what that is. And so you know the criteria for being in that set.
And we can even distinguish between sizes of infinite sets. Like this one's going to have more numbers, even though they're both infinite. I can grasp that. Yeah. I can compare and contrast them even.
But yeah, and we can we can grasp sets that are, we can grasp the set of real numbers, right? And we can grasp, the set of natural numbers by like you just kind of knowing the recursive enumeration, right? Like, so there's lots of ways that we can grasp infinite sets, right? And that, so that's not a problem, right? Because so you could just say, okay, he can easily account for this, grasp of the infinite. But what choice gives you are these infinite sets that aren't necessarily going to be sets that you can get with a well-defined predicate or any sort of recursive enumeration procedure. So, I mean, I gave a specific example of some sets that so there's sets that you can get from the axiom of choice that you don't need the axiom of choice for, right?
Okay.
Right. But then there are some sets that you can't get without the axiom of choice, right?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so I was like, those are the sets I'm going to focus on, because if there's another way of getting at the set that doesn't rely on choice, then it's not going to be inaccessible in the relevant way, right?
Right. And then you might
So
not then you wouldn't need the axiom of choice anyways, right?
right, you
It
don't
would,
need it,
yeah.
right? So I needed to point out sets, to like focus on sets that are what I call choice only.
Mhm.
And actually, talking to Christopher Menzel really helped me a lot.
Yeah.
I talked to him a lot about the stuff, and he helped me a lot with this, because it does get pretty difficult and confusing.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting paper too. I hate mispronouncing these. I think his name is Jose Ferreros.
You can mispronounce on the I call it Parker's Pensées, so everyone's going to be used to mispronunciation on this podcast. Yeah.
Okay, well, sorry, I feel bad when I do that, but on I can't remember the name of the paper, but it's basically kind of making this point about how choice gets you these arbitrary,
Yeah.
intuitively arbitrary sets. I mean, that's sort of the rough intuitive word, but I was able to come up with a specific example of these Vitali sets that are subsets of the closed interval between 0 and 1.
Mhm.
So real numbers. And they are, I mean, there's just this whole, thing about they're not Lebesgue measurable. And so that shows that they can be proved to exist in ZFC, but not just in ZF without choice.
Okay.
So they're a good example of, I mean, it really doesn't matter what the details are, and you don't even need to like follow them at all.
Right.
The only thing that matters is here's an example of sets that you need the axiom of choice for.
And they're choice only. Yeah.
Yeah, they're choice only. And so that means they're like these intuitively arbitrary sets. So there's no way, like there's not like, let's come up with some like predicate, that all and only the members of this set fall under, or let's come up with some procedure to get all, like they're infinite, right? And they don't have either of those. They're not accessible in either of those ways.
Yeah.
So that's why, I mean, it was just for the sake of like having an example. And like I said, just kind of like trying to force Scott Soames, like somebody's like, he has to, like, there's no way he can't, like, he's going to have to acknowledge these. And I mean, yeah, there are people that do, like, the axiom of choice is weird and a lot of people don't like it. And there are people that reject it. And there's like, different set theories that don't have choice and stuff like that. And I have another paper on this where I kind of talk a little bit more about that. But for this debate, I just think like it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Because if we're philosophers, and this isn't a philosophy of math debate,
Yeah.
right? So we're philosophers, and like if you're doing like philosophy of language or theories of propositions, like you can't, like, you don't want your theory of propositions to be like forcing you to adopt this like non-standard position about set theory.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. It should be able to encompass what the mathematicians are saying, or the philosophers of math are saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
That
should
makes
be able to just kind of like, I mean, and obviously, again, like somebody could just say like, well, I have such strong like arguments for this view that I'm just gonna like go with it and adopt some alternate set theory or something like that. But
Right.
there's always a way to resist. There's always more bullets you can bite.
Sure.
But I know that Soames wouldn't want to do that. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. That works. Yeah, it runs against him. Yeah, that's so good. Can we talk like dependency?
Sure.
Yeah. So I got the definition here. It's just the dependency. A proposition P represents only if, for some possible finite agent A, the representation of P is derived from the representation of A, some act or state of A. So you argue that this dependency is like I don't know if it's a necessary condition or something, but it's like integral for propositional naturalism. Can you help us understand this?
Yeah, so basically, the propositional naturalism is going to run a trace the representational power of propositions always to something naturalistically acceptable. And
Yeah,
so that's why I'm like, it has to be some possible finite agent. And
yeah,
again, I'm saying possible because I'm allowing the like non-actualist
yeah. Possible world
stuff
stuff.
to fly. I'm just
Yeah,
like, I mean, because I think there's so many places where you could put on the brakes with this view and say like, hey, wait a minute, no. Like, I mean, in terms of this argument, right? Like,
right,
there's so many. But I was kind of trying to concede as much as possible to Soames and not making I was like, I don't want to make this an argument about actualism because that's just
right.
be kind of boring.
Yeah,
And so let's just see how far we can go, granting him all of his commitments that he has. And so that's why it talks about that, but just saying that like any propositional naturalist view is going to have to be um have to accept something like this principle.
yeah,
And then so that means if there are transcendent propositions, then there are going to be then that principle can't be right.
yeah. I love that, and I really do. I love the way you set it up because you're just granting stuff left and right, and you're trying to be as broad as possible to catch as many people as you can with the argument. I think, which is really fun. So then the whole idea of the scarcity objection and the axiom of choice and ZFC was just to get to the fact that there are transcendent propositions, and then that's like the key. Like once you have a transcendent proposition, now dependency is false, and some NCP, naturalized cognitive propositions, like that's false. So like the whole move is to get to these transcendent propositions, and then from there, does that seem right? Like once you get there, like the dominoes just fall in place?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I hope so. That was
Yeah, yeah,
that was the idea. And really you could go either way. So, I mean, I have another paper arguing against these views and saying like, look, if you don't accept the possibility of an infinite intellect, this is just a reductio of the view.
yeah,
Uh, so it really can go either way. Either it's a reductio of sort of the whole, naturalized cognitive proposition view, or it's an argument for something like God, right? That this an infinite, or at least a possible infinite intellect. And then, I mean, I guess, right, a possible infinite intellect, depending on your other kind of modal views and things like that, and your, what you think about like the modal ontological argument and things like that,
right,
that
yeah,
to the actual infinite intellect.
yeah. That is super cool. I actually, until you just said that, I hadn't thought about this in context of the modal ontological argument, but yeah, this could help that argument, because there's like the parity problem of like why maybe we're at a stalemate between God being necessary or necessarily non-existent, and so maybe this could help tip. And I guess you wouldn't need the ontological argument for this, but yeah, you could just keep adding them together, which would be fun. And that's like the argument from so many arguments maybe in this book. That's so fascinating. I really like. So can you let's go, like we went in super deep and I even got lost a little bit here. Can we go like way up and just sketch it again? So like beginning like get us to transcendent propositions, and then it should be pretty quick from there to a transcendent mind, right?
Um,
Just like overview, like
yeah. So if you think that all like so if you think about if you have this idea that truth, like being true and false, right, being truth apt, right, um involves some sort of representation, right,
yeah,
that's one step, right, because like I said, there are going to be people that think, oh, you've got these truth bearers, they don't have to be representational, right?
right.
So the first link is between truth and representation,
Hmm.
and I think that's pretty intuitive. I think a lot of people would buy that, right?
Yeah,
And so then how do you think about representation? Do you think, does all representation have to derive from something mental,
yeah,
right? And if you think yes, right, then that gets you into either a sort of Soames or Hanks kind of view, or psychologistic sort of view, right?
Yeah.
Modern philosophy kind of view, propositions or judgments, right? So, but you've got some view like that where either propositions are thoughts or they're deriving the representationality from thoughts. But
Yeah.
either way, you've got thoughts in this like really important role, because without the thoughts, you don't have the propositions, right? Either because the propositions are thoughts or they're dependent on the thoughts for their representational properties, right?
Right.
So then, okay, fine. Well, but if you think there are truths, right, that a human thinker or like a finite thinker, I guess, like maybe there's some intelligent aliens out there or something
Yeah.
like that. I don't know.
Right.
So to kind of like leave it open, right? But if you think there are truths that no finite thinker can represent or grasp or whatever, cognize, whatever word you want to use there, right? Then that's kind of opening the door to, well, now if you want the representation of any truth bearer to be grounded in a thought, now you need a thinker that can think that kind of a thought, right?
Yeah.
You need a thinker with that kind of mental power, right? And if it's like this infinite thing, right? Like the example of the sets. So in the specifically, the example I used would be a singular proposition, right, about one of these infinite sets that doesn't have any sort of there's no procedure, right, that's that you could that's finitely learnable, right, that would enable you to grasp that thought, right?
Axiomizable or something. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's plausible you need an infinite thinker to think those thoughts, right, or to grasp those propositions or whatever, to ground the representation of those propositions. And so that's where you get the infinite thinker, who would be something like God, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad that that I had you on to talk about this, because I misunderstood it until you've helped me see this, that it just needs to be a singular proposition about an infinite set that doesn't correspond to some kind of code or axiom or whatever. So this is so good. I really I really like this. I'm gonna have to listen back to this episode, and you've thrown so much like good stuff that I'm gonna have to dig into. So that was a really helpful overview. There's a like a second version of the argument from intentionality that I have a slide for, just for anyone who is like following and wants to see it in propositional form again. So it's just propositions represent essentially, that's the premise. 2, only agents represent fundamentally. 3, so propositions depend for their existence on agents. 4, there are propositions that no finite agent entertains, transcendent propositions that we talked about. 5, the representation of transcendent propositions is independent of the representation of finite agents. 6, so transcendent propositions cannot depend on finite agents, from 3 and 5. 7, therefore there's an infinite agent. It's so good. It's so fun. Have you do you know if has Scott Soames, has he seen this? Do you know? Have you
Well,
interacted with him at all?
yeah. So when was this? Like, I don't know if it was 2014 or something. There was a propositions workshop in Leeds.
Okay.
And so I presented there, and Jeff Speaks was there, and Scott Soames and Jeff King, and I believe Frederica Moltmann was also there. So I presented this early version of this argument, not the one that's in this volume for God, but sort of the reductio version of the argument.
Oh yeah, sure.
So so I did present that at that workshop, so he was able to to hear that argument, and he did say that he was worried about it at the time.
Nice. That's awesome.
So I was like, oh, good.
Yeah, really
But there was a lot of discussion at the time too about like, oh, the axiom of choice and all this, how it's going to work. But I think at the time, I don't remember if I had Vitali sets in there at the time. Like, I think it was more just kind of like, oh, the axiom of choice is going to get you these sets. And I wasn't, I hadn't gotten as much into the weeds. And then I kind of, thought about it more and talked to some people, and fleshed it out a bit more to try to make it more kind of give it more of a punch, make it more concrete, right, and like harder to kind of wiggle out of. So so he was familiar with that, and I don't really know if he's ever so like I have this paper, then I have another paper in Archenus with the other argument. So I don't know if he's looked at them or not. I have no idea. But
yeah, that's so cool. Well, so before we got into the argument, you were saying that maybe you don't buy all the premises of the argument, and that's something that's really fascinating that I really like as I've been learning philosophy myself and getting into it. Like, philosophers a lot of times will present an argument and just say like, hey, if this sticks, it sticks. Maybe I'm not saying that this is the end all be all or anything like that. I actually really appreciate that. I've been trying to do that myself with some of the papers I've been presenting recently, where I'm like, if you go in for this, then this follows, but maybe you don't have to go in for that. So what do you think of this argument? Like, do you think that this should lead to someone believing in God?
Yeah, I don't. So like I said, I hold a lot of views in philosophy lately. Like I mean, so I think that here's what I think. I think if you think that all representation has to come from minds, right? If the only fundamental representation is done by agents, I guess, then I think it's going to be hard to get all the representation you need from definitely from humans, but really from any finite minds. And so I think that if you do hold that view, which I think is not an implausible view, then I think that this argument should convince you that there must be something more. I mean, I could see people resisting it being God and things like that, and kind of going different ways. But I think that, I mean, I guess I'm still, I kind of impartial to the traditional conception of propositions. And so that's why I'm not as moved by this argument. But I also realized, like, I feel like, so I'm kind of a Platonist and stuff like that. And I do think there's a tension with that, with theism. And I've been working on the whole God and abstract objects thing too. That's like another sort of
Nice. I love that
side project. I do think it's hard to be, it's hard to work all that. I think that these issues are really hard, but I think it's fun. Like, I like the challenge. Like, I actually like the constraints, like the fact that I'm, a theist of a certain sort and things like that, like, means I have these constraints I have to work with. But to me, it's just like creates this challenge. It's like a fun, like, problem that you have to solve. It's like roll up your sleeves and figure out how's this all going to work, right? How are you going to hold all these things together? And I like that. So
yeah, I really like that too. I was when I was coming into philosophy at first, I was a little bit nervous about that, and I was like, man, I don't know. It seems like maybe that's not. Maybe the philosopher ought to just like let go of all constraints and just follow the truth wherever it goes. And then as I'm learning more about like Christian philosophy, it's like, well, Christian philosophy, theistic philosophy, like, it's philosophy on hard mode because you have convictions, and you're like, I can't believe that. And so what's the reason, like, how do I make sense of this and my faith, and this belief that God exists? And like you said, it is really fun to get into that. I wonder even if you do like this argument and you are a theist, this might be an argument against believing that, like, God is finite even. So I believe that Keith Yandel thinks that God is not infinite, or thought that God is not infinite. I believe, hopefully I'm not misrepresenting him. And he was a Platonist as well. So yeah, maybe he could just, it'd be fun to think through that kind of stuff too. Like, if you hold a view of God that's not, that is finite, well, this argument might run against that. And you say, well, maybe you should believe in an infinite God because there's these, because of the axiom of choice,
Well, I don't know if that's his view. I thought his view was that God isn't necessary. I thought it was just that God's contingent.
I believe it's both.
Is it both? Is it finite too? I didn't know
I believe
that.
so. I know Swinburne says, that's like really popular, that Swinburne also believes that God is not necessary. And I know the two were on board with that, but I believe he didn't think that God was infinite. I think there was like a problem with the idea of infinity. I think that he was saying, like, that's not coherent. But if there's a Yandel scholar out there, please, I'll love to be corrected on that.
Somebody needs to tell the mathematicians.
Yeah.
Infinity isn't coherent.
Yeah, right. I think for a being to be infinite, and have a nature maybe.
Yeah, no, I was sorry. I was teasing. That
Yeah,
wasn't
no,
really
no,
fair. I'm
yeah,
sure that he'd already thought of that
yeah,
and everything.
super
But
sharp
yeah,
dude. Yeah.
no, I didn't know that.
I
That's
could totally be
yeah.
misrepresenting him. I have seen, I'm looking at his books right now, and I'm like, please be in there. I think it's in there. I'll look that up and maybe correct the record if I'm wrong.
It's fine. I forget everything all the time. So like I said, like I had to look at this again and I'm still like, wait a minute, let me look at this.
Yeah.
I don't want to make sure I don't say the wrong thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, I hear you. There's just too
There's so much.
much
There's some.
information.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, Dr. Keller, what are some things that you're working on nowadays?
So I'm working on John Henry Newman actually.
Oh wow.
Working on some stuff on his idea about real and notional assent, his thoughts about that.
Okay.
So I'm working on that, and I'm also working on my husband John and I are co-authoring a paper. It's on like a form of semantic anti-realism.
Okay.
We keep changing what we call the view, so actually I'm not sure what the latest
Yeah.
name of the view is, but there's a volume on linguistic idealism that's coming out, so we're writing a paper for that together, which we really need to get on that actually. But yeah, but I'm writing and I'm doing a couple of Newman papers.
Hmm.
I think that's all right now that I'm actively writing. But
Yeah.
yeah.
That sounds awesome. Are there any things that you and your husband, any philosophical positions that you guys are totally at odds with each other on?
I know when I started grad school, I was a compatibilist and he was a libertarian, and I've since converted.
Oh no,
And I'm
he
a
got you.
libertarian now.
Oh no. Okay.
But are you a compatibilist?
Yeah. Sad. Everyone type an F in the comments for respect. We lost one here. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think free will is really hard. And again, like I said, I hold most of my views in philosophy pretty lightly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't really know. What are we at odds about? I'm a pretty hardcore classical theist, and I think he's not, as sanguine about some aspects of classical theism as I
Sure.
am.
Sure.
I'm just kind of like all in divine simplicity, all that kind of stuff, and I think he's a little more concerned. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'd say we're at odds about it, but
You hold it
I should ask
differently.
him.
Yeah, it's a
I
different
mean, I
swing.
think he's more like he thinks there are more worries about it, and he's, but yeah, I don't know. Like, what do we?
Well, so with that, like I want to affirm simplicity. I don't see I'm coming out of theology into philosophy, and it seems like all the theologians are like, dude, you got to have simplicity if you want the Trinity. And then I get over into philosophy, and they're all like, well, simplicity? No way. You don't get the Trinity then. And right now, I'm seeing it more as like a liability than an explanatory, virtue. But I still want to affirm it. But then I really like these conceptual arguments in divine conceptualism type stuff. Do you see any like if I affirm your argument, which I really do like it, it's hard to make sense of simplicity with God having like these ideas that
Yes,
right?
definitely. Yeah, actually, I was working on a paper about that very thing, right? Like, how do you? So there's a push to, well, a classical theist sort of push to want to make God the source of all, you know, um, whatever things play the abstract object rules, right?
Right.
To ground that all in God because of divine aseity, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But then also from classical theism, it's like you want to affirm simplicity.
Yeah.
And so that does seem like a problem because it's like there are these distinctions. It looks like there are these distinctions in God, like there are these different thoughts, things like that. I mean, I think, with a lot of these problems, I'm like, yet we know that there were these, people like Aquinas, stuff like that, that affirmed simplicity and aseity. Aquinas was kind of, I guess, not, well, he definitely wasn't a Platonist. Okay.
Yeah.
So he didn't have that problem, but he did talk about actually now I'm afraid I'm going to say something wrong. And some Thomas is going to be like,
As soon as you
that's
talk about
wrong.
Aquinas, I know.
She butchered Aquinas. No, I think, God's omniscient. God knows things on Aquinas' view, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think like, there's got to be like, I always say like, there's got to be a way of like making this work, right? I mean, I guess you could just say like, well, maybe Aquinas just had an incoherent view or something like that, or the fact that he wasn't a Platonist means he didn't have to do this other stuff that you have to do.
Yeah.
I think it is really hard. It's really challenging, but I also think like I'm partial to a view of God that says that our language and thoughts about God are kind of always going to misrepresent God in some way,
Because of
right?
the analogical predication.
Something like that. I mean, I have
Okay.
kind of a different way of spelling it out, but something like that. And so I think that, when we say things like, oh, these are divine thoughts, or like God knows this, or something like that, like it's never going to be, there's always going to be something, what's the word I'm looking for, inapt about it, right?
Okay.
About those predications. And so that I think helps with the tensions, right? Because a lot of things you say like, oh, well, if we say like this person had this thought and that thought, or they know P and they know Q or whatever, like, okay, there's certain things follow from that, right? They can't just be a simple being. But like with God, I just think that's not necessarily the case, because God's way of knowing, God's way of thinking is not like ours.
Yeah.
And so I just think too, some of the problems here just come from anthropomorphizing God too much.
Okay.
Right. Then of course you get the whole like, well, then what do we mean when we're saying these things? Like, are we just completely in there? And so trying to have some sort of middle ground there. And I know a lot of people are skeptical that like, well, we can't really do that. You're either going to be like, go with univocity or equivocity. Like, I do think I want to go with some sort of middle ground, sort of.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. And so but I do think that can actually help with a lot of these problems. Because I think of simplicity and other doctrines like that is really more like negative doctrines.
Sure.
Or like more like telling you what God is not, and like
Yeah.
how you shouldn't be thinking about God and stuff like that. Like if you're thinking of God like this, you're wrong, kind of thing. But not so much. It's not like, oh, that means God's a marble or something, or like God's an atom, or like it's like no.
Yeah. I think that's a really helpful clarification about. So for all the theology nerds, it's like, or for those who aren't theology nerds, apophatic theology and cataphatic theology, and yes, like I guess when you do apophatic, when you do negative theology, you're still kind of saying something positive, but it's not like, it doesn't have to be like this full throttle. Like, here's God is a marble, or God's like this, metaphysical, simple, like, it's just saying he doesn't have parts. Which is tough, but this is why God and abstract objects is like my favorite puzzle to work on. It keeps me up at night, and which is really tough, but I'm so glad to hear that you're working on that as well. Excited to see. Yeah,
I was, and I kind of dropped it, but
oh no,
should go back. It's a great problem.
Yeah.
And I know other like I think Michelle Panchuk has a nice paper on this where she talks about simplicity and abstract objects and stuff. And I can't remember. I think it's from 2016, but I think she has something on this that might be worth checking out if you're interested in that problem.
Yeah, I think I'm looking around for it. I think I have that somewhere. But anyways, Dr. Keller, thanks so much for all your time here. This was really fascinating and really fun. If somebody wanted to check out more of your work or your husband John's work, is there a place that I can find your stuff?
So I'm on Phil Papers. I have a Phil Papers profile. I have a website too, but I don't actually. John made my website, and I have no idea. So I feel like I don't want to like take responsibility for. But I mean, I'm sure he did a good job and all. But like, I don't really know, and I don't know if it's updated. But I have Phil Papers, and I have an academia page too. So
awesome. Yeah, I will. I'll link that in the description, folks. So if you're hearing this now, go ahead and check the description for more work from Dr. Keller. And I'll throw in John's as well too. One flesh type stuff here. That'd be really fun. Thanks so much for all your time, folks. That's gonna have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.